CHAPTER 11 of the Tale of Grandfather Mole. LibriVox.org. The Tale of Grandfather Mole by Arthur Scott Bailey. Chapter 11. Surprising Grandfather Mole. Somehow Grandfather Mole heard that Mrs. Robin hoped to capture the biggest angleworm in the garden. So the very next time he happened to find her at work there, he offered her another bit of unsought advice. And Mrs. Robin liked it no better than any other of Grandfather Mole's counsels. "Don't waste your valuable time looking for the biggest angleworm in the garden," he told her. "I've caught him already." Well, for once Mrs. Robin almost said something tart to the old gentleman. But she checked herself in time, not by biting her tongue, however, but by clapping her bill upon a fat bug that was trying to hide under a potato top, and away she flew to her nest, leaving Grandfather Mole to talk to the air if he wished. "She went off without thanking me," he muttered. To be sure, he hadn't seen Mrs. Robin go, but he had heard the beat of her wings as she began her flight. He didn't know that he had barely escaped a sharp scolding. "What do you think Grandfather Mole has just said to me?" Mrs. Robin asked her husband, whom she found at the nest feeding their children. Jolly Robin made 3 guesses, but none of them was right. So his wife repeated Grandfather Mole's remarks, and as usual Jolly Robin laughed. "I shouldn't pay any attention to what Grandfather Mole says," he advised his wife. "I should keep an eye out for big angleworms if I were you. Grandfather Mole may be mistaken. He may have caught only the second biggest one." What her husband said made Mrs. Robin feel better, and she declared that she would surprise Grandfather Mole yet. Strange to say, the very next day Grandfather Mole spoke to Mrs. Robin again and told her that there was no use trying to surprise him, so she needn't waste her valuable time trying to do it. This news made Mrs. Robin quite speechless. She couldn't think how Grandfather Mole had happened to learn of her remark, unless her husband had been gossiping with his friends. And if that was the case, Mrs. Robin didn't mean to let anything of the kind occur again. So she went on searching for her children's breakfast and said nothing to anyone about Grandfather Mole's latest bit of advice. Mrs. Robin worked harder than ever that day. It seemed to her husband that she had eyes for nothing but worms. Certainly she paid little attention to him, so he couldn't help feeling pleased when she called him toward evening. He flew quickly to her side, and he saw at once that she needed his help, for Mrs. Robin had an end of pinkish-white worm in her bill, on which she was tugging as hard as she could. "I think it's the biggest one in the garden," she managed to gasp, "but it simply won't come up out of the ground." "It must be the grandfather of them all!" Jolly Robin cried, and laying hold of the worm himself, he pulled with her. Somehow there seemed a great commotion in the loose dirt at their feet, as they struggled to get the worm out of its hiding place. And at last, to their great delight, they felt it, saw it coming. Then a shower of dirt flew into their faces, and both Jolly Robin and his wife tumbled over backward. It was no worm that Mrs. Robin had found, but Grandfather Mole's hairless tail sticking out of the ground. Together they had dragged him to the surface. And if Mrs. Robin hadn't found the grandfather of all angleworms, at least she had found Grandfather Mole. And she had given him a surprise too. End of Chapter 11.